All right, you guys. That's enough. That's enough. All right, hey, this is Coach Culbertson, and you're watching How to Make Believe You Have More Servers Than You Really Do, also known as Setting Up Hyper-V in Server 2008 for Fun and Profit. So in this video, let's talk about briefly what it is we're going to be dealing with. First of all, in what? You mean I don't need more hardware? Yep, that's right. We're going to talk about virtualization as a whole and kind of give you a quick overview of virtualization and Hyper-V in specific. Then I'm going to walk you through what you need to set up a Hyper-V server of your very own. And, well, then we're going to turn right around and we're going to do it. We're going to create a Hyper-V server and start our initial, or I really should say our very first virtual machine for this series. So here's what we're starting off with in this one. First of all, I do have a domain controller that's up and running, and this is literally all that I really have. I have it's called NYDC1 2K8, and it is running Active Directory domain services. Like I said, it's a domain controller, and it's also running DNS. Okay. I do have a domain set up on it. It's globalmantics.com. I know, a big surprise, right? And we are running at a Server 2008 functional level for this entire series, pretty much. Now, in this video, to our network, what we're going to do is we're going to add in a machine that's named Hyper-V, and of course is going to be joined to the globalmantics.com domain. Now, just so you know, I've already installed the operating system. I've renamed the machine. I'll show you what I've done to it. I haven't really done a lot of work on that machine specifically. So after I kind of walk you through what I have done to that machine, then we're going to install Hyper-V, and we're going to create our very first virtual machine. And just so you know, we're going to be doing virtual machine stuff all the way throughout this course because it's way cool. And so there's a lot of really neat intricacies that we can get into. But the very first machine we're going to be using in our next video, where we're going to be creating a deployment server. So I didn't want to launch into the next video without having that particular virtual machine set up, at least installed anyway, and we'll do the rest of our setup in the next video for that Windows Deployment Services machine. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about what virtualization is. Let me give you an overview and describe it for you a little bit. Now, in most 20th century networks, you have a whole bunch of servers scattered all over the place. And all of these servers have very specific functions. Well, in virtualization, really what we get into doing is we end up having one physical box, but we're going to have multiple software servers, okay? So we may have one really strong server class machine. We might have several different servers. Let's say that we have a DNS server. DNS servers make really good virtual machines. Let's say that we might have a deployment server because that's what we're going to be doing. And then we might have a media server too. Okay? We're going to be building a media server in this one. We can have all three of these servers living on one physical machine. Okay? Now, initially it sounds kind of weird, I know, and hang tough with me because I'll get you through the full explanation here. But these software servers are actually instances of operating systems. And these instances of operating systems, we actually use hard drive files called VHDs, virtual hard disk. Okay? And these virtual hard disks live as files on a physical hard disk. Nothing that complex, but when we have multiple virtual machines, all of the hard disks live as files on the physical hard disk itself. Now, the virtual servers, the virtual operating systems, and this is probably going to kind of be a no-brainer to most of you, but these are actually going to be running in RAM, all right? And they're going to be sharing the physical hardware on the machine. They're going to be sharing the RAM, they're going to be sharing the processors, sharing the network card, all the hardware on the physical server they're probably going to have access to. Now, you don't have to have access for every single machine to every single piece of hardware, but in a lot of instances you will. So the whole idea of a virtual machine is you're going to have multiple servers, or really multiple operating systems. Let's not just limit it to servers. Let's talk about operating systems. We can actually have different operating systems running on one physical machine. Now, there's all kinds of implementations of virtualization. VMware has been a leader in the field for a really long time. There's a lot of different virtualization products out there. Hyper-V is the Microsoft specific implementation of virtualization, and there's several advantages to having virtualized machines. First of all, is ease of administration. When you have a virtual machine running, one of my favorite features of virtualization is you can take a snapshot of the machine as it is right then and there. Then you can monkey around with a virtual machine, and if you break something, it's not nearly as cataclysmic as if it was on a physical machine, because then you can just go back to the previous snapshot or the state of the server when you took the snapshot. Very nice. There's all kinds of administration quirks that go along with virtualization. But here's a big one for a lot of people. Hardware costs are significantly reduced because multiple virtual machines can run on a single physical machine, just like I was talking with you about earlier. And let me tell you something it's semi-well known, but you may not be familiar with this, is that a lot of power companies are starting to give rebates to large companies and small companies, medium companies, for every server that they take offline, thereby reducing their power consumption. Well, the reality is that you still need that server's functionality, but if you take a physical server, virtualize it, and move it onto maybe kind of a consolidation box where you have a lot of servers running on one physical machine, you're reducing your hardware cost, not to mention your power cost as well. So there are some companies, especially out in California, they stand to literally get millions of dollars from this server rebate program that some of the companies have out in that direction. So if you are planning on implementing virtualization, might be something that you might want to look at, see if a power company in your area has a rebate available for such things. Hyper-V licensing costs. Here's the nice thing, is that you actually get up to 4 virtual machines with every copy of Server 2008. That is a big bonus. So not only are you saving on the hardware costs, but you're also saving on the licensing costs. It isn't going to cost you any more to run up to 4 virtual machines per copy of your Server 2008. So already you're starting to see the profit side, and the ease of administration is where the fun comes in, by the way. But I mean, that's huge. In these 2 items, I mean, this is where, you know, the vast majority of your costs lie anyway, right? Now, does that mean that it's going to take less manpower to manage those servers? Maybe not. But at the very least, we've reduced hardware and licensing costs. Now, here's another big deal, all right? Fault tolerance through Hyper-V cluster. You can actually cluster together Hyper-V servers. So that way, if one dies, you still have a failover happening. We are going to talk about clustering in this video series, by the way. And here's another big one. Both 32-bit and 64-bit guest operating systems are supported, including Linux. Microsoft has started to see that the world does not only run on Microsoft, and a lot of folks have a lot of Linux servers out there, so you can virtualize a Linux server on a Windows Server 2008 machine. So pretty nifty. All right, so now you've talked a little bit about the advantages. Let me tell you about what actually makes all this hyper virtualization stuff happen, all right? We have a thin layer of software called the Windows Hypervisor between all of the operating systems that we may have and the hardware. So this little software piece actually allows all of these different operating systems to utilize and to share the Windows Server hardware. So that's really what makes all of this possible. So a lot of cool stuff happening under the hood that we don't really always get to see necessarily when we're actually implementing Hyper-V. All right, so now let's talk about what it is that you need to set up a Hyper-V server of your very own. So let's talk about the requirements. And actually, this isn't really much of a hardware requirement as it is a software requirement, but you can only run Hyper-V on Server 2008 64-bit Enterprise or Data Center Edition. All right, so if you try to run it on the 32-bit Enterprise, it's not going to work. Now, can you run 32-bit versions of Server 2008 on a 64-bit box? Absolutely, not a problem there. All right, how much RAM do you need? Well, it depends. You need a minimum of 512, a half a gig of RAM to actually install Server 2008 to begin with. But obviously, 512 megabytes is not going to be enough to run multiple operating systems. So The question of, how much RAM are you going to need is largely going to depend on how many virtual machines you're actually going to be running on that physical box. Your processor, though, it must be 64-bit. There's a big surprise, right? Since we have a 64-bit operating system. And that 64-bit processor must support virtualization. AMD and Intel both make 64-bit processors specifically for this application. So just make sure that if you're building your own box from scratch, make sure that you look at the specifications for that processor and that it has virtual extensions available. Hard drive space. Well, how much do you need? That's also going to vary by situation. As always, my recommendation is the more the better, right? Now, network cards. You need at least 2 network cards. Let me tell you why. You need one for your virtual machines to share, and we're going to be creating what we call a virtual network. But then you also are going to need one for your physical machine to use. So for your management stuff, you're going to want to reserve one of those network cards for the physical machine for managerial tasks. All right, so at least 2. Now, here's my suggestion to you. I would never even think about running Hyper-V on a server that had anything less than 4 gigabytes of RAM. This will allow you to have your virtual machines running at least a half a gig of RAM a piece, but the more RAM the better, but at the very least you should have 4 gigabytes of RAM. Processor 2 gigahertz at least with virtualization support, and I also recommend having a quad core or dual core processor, and then at least 2 hard drives. Right? Let me tell you why. I think you should have one hard drive of 250 gigs at least, one for the server operating system, your quote-unquote host operating system, and then you should also have a separate hard drive for your virtual machine hard drive files, for your VHD files like I was talking with you about earlier. This way, let's say that your operating system, your host operating system, completely tanks. All right, so if your server OS hard drive dies, don't worry too much about it. You can take out the hard drive that contains your VHD files, put it into another Server 2008 machine, and go ahead and load your virtual machines right back up. Now, I'm telling you this because, well, I've had issues with having my server operating system and my virtual hard drives on the same disk, i.e. my disk died and I lost everything. So don't play that game, all right? Make sure you have separations between the operating system for your host Server 2008 and your VHD files. All right, so let's talk about the GlobalManTix thing. What is our plan? Here's the deal. As the GlobalManTix head geek, you have to get ready to implement a SharePoint server for collaboration, a terminal services server for using networked applications, and a media server for streaming video training and messages from the head boss, Hank Richardson, our CEO. Some of you might remember Hank from our Active Directory course and a couple of other courses he's made some appearances in. But as the head geek, you know that the budget for hardware is low, but you have plenty of licenses for Server 2008 just kind of lying around. Remember that you can run up to 4 copies of Server 2008 on the same box when you have virtual machines. Okay? It's a beautiful thing. Fortunately, you also have a pretty decent server class box with 4 gigs of RAM. You've got a quad-core processor and about a terabyte of disk space just hanging out. What you've decided to do is that you're going to provide these services, we're going to get ready for these services using virtual machines rather than trying to beg Hank to get you some more hardware. So we've got at least what we need. So you need to get Hyper-V installed on that Server 2008 box. And just so you know, Hyper-V actually shows up as a role in Server Manager in the 64-bit edition of Server 2008. So you're going to start by checking the server requirements. I'm going to kind of walk you through the different requirements so you know where all that's at. We're going to set up the hard drives a little bit. We actually have a blank hard drive that we need to set up for our virtual hard disks. And then we're going to go ahead and install the Hyper-V role. After we have that Hyper-V role installed, we're going to create our first virtual machine for our Windows deployment server for our next video. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to Remote Desktop to the Hyper-V machine that I've already built. Remember, I've installed the operating system and I've renamed the machine Hyper-V. I'll show you everything else that I've done to the machine as soon as we get over to it, and then we're going to go from there. All right, so here you see that I'm over here on the server manager for Hyper-V, And you see that I have installed Server 2008 here, obviously. I have renamed the machine to Hyper-V. I have joined it to the globalmantics.com domain. I have specified static IP addresses for both of my network cards. And I have remote desktop enabled, which is kind of funny to say because, well, if remote desktop wasn't enabled, we wouldn't be able to see this. All right, so you've seen what I've done to the machine. Very, very basic configuration. If I go over here to the role section, you see that no roles have been installed. All that's happened thus far is it's been renamed and joined to the domain. Now, real quick, let me take you over here. I want to show you what I have in terms of my hardware. I'm going to right-click on Computer and go into Properties. And you see here that I do have 4 gigs of RAM. You see that I do have a quad-core processor here. And you see that they're running around a little more than 2 gigahertz. I do have the 64-bit edition of Enterprise running here, so my machine's looking pretty good. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this box here. And now I'm going to go over here to the Server Manager. We're going to go into Storage. We need to do just a little bit of configuration here in disk management. Let me show it to you here. It takes just a little bit for it to load up. But you see, here is my disk 0, my main disk, disk C. And you see it's about a half a terabyte. Not quite, but just about. Then you see I have another disk that is just hanging out down here that is unallocated. Now you see that this disk is currently online. Now when I right-click on this disk, I can go ahead and take it offline if I so desired. I don't know why I would want to. Right-click and bring it back online. All right, so this disk is online. Now at this point in time, I could convert it to a dynamic disk if I want to run like a RAID mirror. Now RAID, as you probably know already, it stands for Redundant Array of Inexpensive or Independent Disks, depending upon who you ask. We're not going to convert this guy to a dynamic disk. This guy is just going to be a very simple volume, because all this disk is really going to do for us is it's going to store our virtual hard disk files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allocate some space on this disk. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to create a new simple volume. That's going to open up the new simple volume wizard. Now, what is a volume, you might be asking right now. Now, if you don't already know this, that's okay. But a volume, all it really is a fixed amount of space on a physical disk. That's really all a volume is. And you can actually have multiple volumes on the same physical disk. All right? There's a lot of reasons to do that. Mostly it's for logical and organizational purposes. But I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create a new simple volume. I'm going to initially allow it to use the entire space for the simple volume. Tell it next. I'm going to have it assign the letter G. That'll be okay. And tell it next. I'm going to go ahead and have it format the volume. And I'm going to call this VHD storage here. I'll go ahead and we'll give it a quick name. I'm going to perform a quick format, and I will enable file and folder compression, even though I may or may not use that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and tell it next, and tell it to finish. And now it's going to sit here and spin just a little bit. It won't take very long at all for the initial setup to happen for the disk. But then if I go back and I decide, hey, maybe I don't want to use the entire disk. I mean, almost a half a gig just for VHD files. It seems a little crazy. What I can actually do is I can shrink this volume. Let me go ahead and show you how to do this real quick. If you have empty space, okay, on the disk, if your disk is full, this was not going to work. But if you have empty space, what we can do is we can actually shrink this disk. And you see here that it is actually kind of giving me a quick suggestion of what the server thinks I might want to shrink it down to. Basically, this is actually kind of cutting it in half. It's like I have 238,403 megabytes. So let's go ahead and let's use what it's provided here for me, because what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to have this set of storage for my virtual hard disks, but maybe I'll have a backup over here. I'm thinking pretty hard about this whole idea of taking copies of my virtual hard disk files and storing them in a separate place. Maybe just for backup, maybe for kind of literally a physical snapshot capability. So after I have my initial hard disk set up, I might want to take a copy of that virtual hard disk file and put it over here. I'm going to go ahead and right click. I'm going to create a new simple volume. Tell it next. I'm going to use the whole space. Next. I'm going to assign it drive letter H. That'll be fine. Tell it next. Let's go ahead and let's do a quick format and folder compression. And now let's do VHD backup for this volume label. Tell it next and finish. There we go. So now I have one for my virtual hard disk storage. This will be my active hard disk files. This will be my backups in case I want to have a differentiation between different states and just for really my own convenience. All right, so my storage has been configured. Now you notice that I am not using dynamic disks at this point. Okay, now dynamic disks, like I told you earlier, are RAID-specific arrays. I'm not a real big fan of using software-based RAID arrays because I've had problems with them in the past. What I actually have in the physical machine is I have two SATA drives. That's what these are. These are two SATA drives on separate SATA channels. So if you're familiar more with the older term IDE, if you want to think about them as two separate IDE drives, I guess you can. SATA is just a whole lot faster. But I'm only working with simple volumes. Now, the only reason that I would ever use a RAID array is if I had a hardware-based RAID solution. Okay, I've had a lot of great success with hardware-based RAID arrays where they have a full chassis where you can just pull disks in and out. Now, that's my personal preference based upon my experience. You may have used software RAID arrays. You might think, hey, these are great and wonderful. I'm going to use them all the time. I'm not so much of a big fan of the software RAID arrays. And since my server does not have a hardware-based RAID solution, I'm going to stick with simple volumes. RAID arrays are wonderful things. Don't get me wrong. I love RAID as long as there's a hardware-based solution and not software. It's not software only, I should say. Okay, so enough chatter about that. Now that we have our disk ready, let's go ahead and go into the role section. Let's get the Hyper-V role installed. I'm just going to go ahead and put a check mark here in Hyper-V and tell it next. Next. On this screen, what you're seeing here is it's asking me which of my network cards do I want to use for my virtual machines to share for network access. Remember how we talked about how virtual machines share the hardware, right? So I'm going to be using network connection 2. My primary local area connection, I'm going to use this for managing the physical machine, but my virtual machines will be using this network card. Can you use both? Well, I suppose you could, but down here you see we recommend that you reserve one network adapter for remote access to the server. To reserve a network adapter, do not select it for use with a virtual network. All right, well, that's what we're going to do. Now, basically, a virtual network, all it really does is allow network card sharing. Okay, I don't want you to be confused by this term virtual network. All we're really doing is we're allowing this one particular network card to be shared amongst all of the machines, or I should say the virtual machines, and this card will be used for only the physical machine. All right, let's tell it next. And now it's going to tell me that this server might need to be restarted after the installation completes. And yes, that will be true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit install. And it's going to take a little bit and spin and install. And then it's going to restart several times. Now, since I am using a remote desktop window to demonstrate this to you, that means I'm going to lose my remote desktop connection. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this thing goes ahead and installs. And as soon as it's finished installing and restarting, then I'll start recording again and I'll take you to the next step. Alright, so you see here that our installation is completed and the machine has restarted. It's telling me here that Hyper-V is installed, but additional steps are required to begin running server workloads on virtual machines, i.e. you have to actually, create virtual machines. So, big surprise there. Let's go ahead and click on the close button. And now I'm going to go over here into the roles section. You see that Hyper-V has been successfully added. And it's going to take just a little bit for this guy to load up here for a second. I'll expand this and click on the Hyper-V Manager, which is where we go to actually create any new and manage any existing Hyper-V machines. Alright, so here we go. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just create a new Hyper-V machine real quick. It's not going to take very long. I'm going to come over here to this new button. You see we have all kinds of stuff over here. We can import virtual machines. We can get into Hyper-V settings. Of course, we don't really have anything to set up yet. Virtual Network Manager. You know what, let's take a look at that real quick. Here is my virtual network that I created during the whole Hyper-V installation process. So I don't have to create a new one unless I have some really interesting reason to do so. But I want to come down here and just look at the connection type real quick. I just want to mention this to you here. The external connection type is a real network connection, exactly what you would think of as a network connection to be. It provides local access as well as internet access. Internal only allows me to only talk to machines on my network, does not provide me internet access, and then private virtual machine network keeps the network connections only on the internal side of the actual physical server. You can't get to the outside world at all. You can really only talk to other virtual machines that are on that physical machine. All right, so let's go ahead and let's close that out. Just wanted to kind of give you that quick look here. Let's go ahead and let's make a new one. I'm going to click on New and select a virtual machine here. And you know, this wizard is really super nice. It makes creating virtual machines really super fast and really super easy. All right, now you see I have actually two options here. I could click on Finish, or I could click on Next to create a virtual machine with a custom configuration. So I could create a virtual machine real quick with default values. Let's go ahead and click on Finish and let's see what those values actually look like. Wow, that was really super fast. Now, when you create a new blank virtual machine, there is no operating system installed on it. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Let's go here to the File menu for this virtual machine and click on Settings. I just want to see what it actually did set up here real quick. Initially, it's going to try to boot from the CD. It set it up with a 0.5 gig of RAM, one virtual processor. And by the way, if you have multiple processors on your motherboard, you can actually utilize them. Let's take a look here at the virtual hard drive, new virtual machine.bhd. That's that BHD file I was talking to you about. But look where it put it. C, users, public documents. That's not really where I want it to be at. I want my virtual hard disk files to be on that separate hard drive that we configured a little earlier in this video. So I'm actually going to stop this right here at this point in time. I'm going to go ahead and close this out and to close this virtual machine. And actually, I really don't think I even want this virtual machine. So I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to select turn off, because I don't need to shut it down because there's no operating system on it. Tell it to turn off. And now I'm just going to go ahead and remove the server. I don't want it. I don't need it. All right, there we go. All right, so you see it kicks me back out to the introduction item. I need to come back over here and click on Connect to Server. I'm going to be connecting to the local Hyper-V server, which is the machine that I'm on. No big surprise here. I could connect to another Hyper-V server if I had another one in my network, but obviously I don't, because we only have a domain controller and this machine. So I'm going to go ahead and tell that okay. Looks like it didn't delete it like it should, so I'm going to right-click on that new virtual machine that I created and select Delete. And it's going to tell me that this actually deletes the virtual machines, but does not delete any virtual hard disks. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that hard disk later on. I'll just have to go search for the VHD file. Let's make another new virtual machine here real quick. And this time I'm actually going to go through the entire wizard, because I want to be able to name my virtual machine. And we're going to call this new virtual machine WDS server. I'm going to store the virtual machine in a different location this time. I'm going to go ahead and browse here real quick. I do want to store it in the VHD storage disk that we created earlier, absolutely. And it will actually create a folder for me, so I don't need to create a new folder right now. So I'm going to cancel out. So G will be just fine. It does tell us that if you plan to take snapshots of this virtual machine, select a location that has enough free space. I mentioned snapshots to you earlier because they're so awesome. I mean, they will literally save you so much time, especially when you are monkeying around with different things. But when you take snapshots, those snapshots take up disk space. If you take enough snapshots, they can eat up your disk space pretty fast. So keep that in mind as you are thinking about implementing snapshots. 0.5 gig of RAM is good enough for a Windows deployment server. So 512, there's no reason to increase or decrease that. Not to mention that 0.5 gig of RAM is what you absolutely have to have in order for a Windows Server 2008 installation. All right, so let's tell it next. So now what we need to do is we need to decide what kind of network is it going to be connected to. Well, we have that virtual network we set up with our very first networking controller, or actually I should say our second networking controller in the physical machine. By applying this virtual network that I created back during the installation process, I'm going to be allowing this machine to talk to the outside world and to the local network. I'm going to tell it next. And now I need to create a virtual hard disk, and WDS server is going to be just fine. And 127 gigs is probably good enough. I could always increase that, but I do have a maximum of 2,040 gigabytes. That's probably more than sufficient to have it be 127 gigs. Now, if you have an existing hard disk that you want to utilize, you can actually attach it here, or you could always attach a virtual hard disk later on if you're not quite sure, if you don't remember a particular location. Now, this is particularly useful. Remember how I was talking to you about how you want 2 hard disks, one for your host system and then one for your virtual hard disk files and your virtual machines, in case your primary operating system takes a dive. You can just pull out your hard disk that contains your virtual hard disk files, pop it into a new Hyper-V server, and attach any virtual hard disks, or you can just import the virtual machines. All right, so kind of keep that in mind for disaster recovery. I'm going to go ahead and tell it next. I'm going to install an operating system from a boot CD or DVD-ROM, and I'm just going to go ahead and use the DVD that's in my DVD drive. I could also use an image file or an ISO file too. So if you download ISO files from, say, TechNet or Microsoft.com, you can actually use those ISO files to boot up with if they're bootable ISO files. If you have an older operating system that you want to install, say like Windows NT, for instance, you could actually use a virtual floppy disk. Probably not going to be a huge amount of need for Windows NT in this day and age, but just in case you do, you can actually use virtual floppy disks. Or you can also install an operating system from a network-based installation server like the one we're going to be creating in the next video. Well, that's not what we want to do just yet because we don't have the WDS. We're creating that Windows Deployment Services server right now. So we're going to install the operating system from the DVD and tell it next. It'll give us a quick look about what's going to happen, and now we're going to tell it to finish. The creation is a pretty fast process, as you see here. It's now going to start booting up from that DVD. I'm going to go ahead and expand this window here so we can see everything that's going on. I'm going to scroll down so you can see that Windows is loading the files. Now, when I try to click in this virtual machine, it's going to give me a message that the mouse is not captured in a remote desktop session. All right, well, since I'm in a remote desktop and I'm viewing a virtual machine, I kind of have a twice removed interface here. I'm going to tell it OK. Eventually what I need to do is I need to install what we call integration services. Now, integration services are basically a set of extensions that allow you to work with the virtual machine in a much more natural and easy process. I'll show you how to install the integration services as soon as the operating system is set up. Now, since I can't use the mouse in the remote desktop environment, I can use the keyboard, and you're going to see me performing some tasks here that don't quite make as much sense because there's no mouse on the screen. So I'm actually going to be using the keyboard. I want you to always keep in mind that anything you can do with the mouse, you can always do with the keyboard. There's always some kind of keyboard sequence or shortcut that will get you to that point. Now, while this is still loading up the installation files, let me take you through some of these buttons up top here. When you do a Control-Alt-Delete in the virtual machine, you don't use the keyboard. You're going to be tempted to, but you don't use the keyboard. You use this little Control-Alt-Delete button. Here's the power button, the start button, and you see it's grayed out because, well, the machine is turned on. We have the stop button or the turn off button, which is about the same as just pulling the plug on your machine. We have the shutdown, which takes it through a natural shutdown. And we also have the save option. We'll hit that later. We can pause the virtual machine, which is way cool. We can reset the virtual machine, or we can also take a snapshot. So I'll show you some of these a little bit later after we get this guy installed. All right, so here you see that I have Windows Server 2008 loaded up, and I'm going to use the keyboard. I'm pressing the Tab key right now. I can use the Shift tab to go backwards, by the way. So Tab and Shift tab to move around inside using the remote desktop option here as I am. I'm going to go ahead and now that next is highlighted, as you see over here, you see my little bitty square. I'm going to press the Enter key, and now I'm going to press the Enter key again to install now. It's just a regular old Server 2008 installation. There's nothing special about it, to tell you the truth. The only difference between a virtual machine and a physical machine is that you're installing to a virtual hard disk file rather than to a physical hard disk. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and skip putting in the product key for the time being and just go ahead and go over to use the Tab key to highlight the next. Press the Enter key. It's going to ask me, do I want to enter the product key now? No, I can always do that later. So I'll go ahead and tell it no with the arrow keys and the Enter key. And again, you can always put in the license key later on. Alright, so now I need to select which version of Windows I want. So I'm going to use the arrow keys now that I've tabbed into the Windows version box. And I think we'll go ahead and we'll go with the Enterprise full installation. You see on this disk I do have all of the versions available to me. So now I'm going to press the Tab key and then press the space bar to put a check mark in the I have selected the edition of Windows that I purchased. Press the Tab key to the next button and hit Enter. And I'm going to press the space bar to accept the license terms. Press the Tab key and press Enter to go to Next. And this is a clean installation, so I'm going to use the Custom option. I'll go ahead and press the Enter key here. And now I get to select the disk that I'm going to install to. Remember that I'm actually installing to a virtual hard disk file, not an actual physical disk. Alright, so it'll be good. I'm going to go ahead and press the Tab key to get down to the next. Just going to leave the defaults as they are. Hit the Enter key. And then away it goes. And so now I can go drink a cup of coffee while this thing installs. It doesn't take that long to install, not any longer than it does for a physical machine. And so I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording for the time being. And as soon as this guy is done installing and rebooting, I'll be right back and take you on to the next step where we're actually going to log into the machine and install those virtualization extensions, i.e. the integration services disk. Alright, so our new installation has completed A-OK here, and again I'm still having to use only the keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and it's going to force me to do the standard creating the administrator password here. So let's go ahead and we'll create that real quick. And now we'll go ahead and tell this guy OK by using the Enter key that time. And it's going to sit here and spin. While it's sitting there and spinning here, let me take you back up here to action. In order to make the machine really play well with all the hardware and networking and all that good stuff, including the mouse, we need to use this Insert Integration Services Setup disk here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to load up an ISO file of a CD-ROM that will actually help us to install the extensions here. I might take it, there we go. Scroll up here in the window here just a little bit. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and press the Enter key to install the Hyper-V integration services. It's telling me that there's already a previous installation there. That's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and tell it okay because it's obviously not working, because when I click out here in the window, it's telling me that the mouse is not captured in the remote desktop session. The mouse is available in a remote desktop session when integration services are installed in the guest operating system. Alright, I'm going to tell it OK. Now, just so you know, do you absolutely have to install integration services? Yeah. I was going to tell you, yeah. Otherwise, there's going to be some stuff that will not work like it's supposed to. Okay? So, if it's at all possible, go ahead and just get it installed and get that up and running. Now, once again, like any other good Windows installation, it is going to prompt me to restart the machine. And I really should say it's going to prompt me to restart the virtual machine anyway, not the physical machine. So once again, I'm going to pause the recording while this integration services is setting up. And then I'll begin recording again once it has rebooted the machine and we're back to our regular scheduled program. Alright, so you see that my virtual machine has rebooted here. And so now I can actually click, as you see, even in the remote desktop session, and I don't get that message. I am going to use this Control-Alt-Delete button here. I'm going to go ahead and use it to log in with. Now I can click around and actually use the mouse instead of only the keyboard. I can go ahead and maximize this window here too to fill up the entire space. And look, wow, that looks a whole lot like a remote desktop window, doesn't it? Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and let's do some quick configuration here. Let's just do a quick changing of the time zone. We'll tell that okay. Let's do some quick, at least turning off the IP version 6 stuff here, because we are not running an IP version 6 network. That means this machine is going to pull its IP address from the DHCP server. And just so you know, my DHCP server is actually running straight off of my switch. All right, so let's close that. So we have completed all the tasks in this very first video. We have created, let me go ahead and resize this guy here and shrink it down. There we go. We have created our Hyper-V server. We've installed that server role. We have installed our first virtual machine, our WDS server. We also did a little bit of storage configuration. We created some simple volumes, for our VHD storage, and also one for our VHD backup. So we have completed everything A-OK. Everything looks like it's running just fine. And so let's go on back over to the slides. Let's do a quick review, and then let's move on to the next video where we actually create the rest of the WDS server. All right, so here's what we have built. Mostly what we worked on was the Hyper-V server, and then we turned around and we created our very first virtual machine with extensions for our future deployment machine. We'll do that in the next video. You saw none of it was very hard, as long as, of course, all of our requirements are met, like having Server 2008 64-bit edition, either enterprise or data center, and all that good stuff. So let's go ahead and let's talk about some new words. Hyper-V, this is a server role in Server 2008 that allows you to run multiple operating systems in virtual machines on a single physical machine. I also probably should mention to you that Hyper-V is actually also available as a separate downloadable product that you can use in conjunction with Server Core. All right, a virtual machine is a software-based instance of an operating system that uses shared physical hardware. A VHD is a file that lives on a physical hard drive that acts like a physical hard drive on a virtual machine. And last but not least, we talked about volumes a little bit. Remember that a volume, all it is just a fixed amount of space on a disk, and a single disk can hold multiple volumes. So, after viewing this video, you should be able to inspect hardware to determine whether or not it will be sufficient for Hyper-V. Remember, you have to have a 64-bit processor, right? You should have, I recommend, at least 4 gigs of RAM. Can you get by with less? You know, you could try it, but wouldn't recommend it. You should be able to configure simple volumes in the storage section of Server Manager in Server 2008. Showed you how to do that. Showed you how to install the Hyper-V role in Server 2008. You should also be able to create a virtual network in Hyper-V, and you saw that we actually did that during the role installation. Then you should also be able to create a virtual machine and install an operating system on the virtual machine. What we did in our first virtual machine is we simply used the DVD for Server 2008. Now in the next video, by the way, I'm going to show you how to create virtual machines and then install using Windows Deployment Services. So we're going to start combining technologies as we learn about each one. Also, you should be able to install those integration services extensions into your virtual machine for ease of use. And again, don't forget, do you have to install integration services? Yeah, yeah, you really do. You could try to get by without them, but I think you're going to find yourself frustrated and probably cussing me if I told you that you didn't have to. But no, you really do. All right, so that wraps up this video. Let's go ahead and let's move on to Windows Deployment Services next.